Now, it is important to remember that when it does come to federal aid, when you do have these intergovernmental relations, as I said before, which are primarily dealing with the transfer of money from the federal government to the various state governments, there are essentially two major types of federal aid for states and localities. Okay, these are known as both categorical grants, and then on the other side you have block grants. Now, you did hear the joke that was made in the crash course video about block grants is when you have the federal government giving out Lego blocks. Now, I will admit I'm a big fan of Legos, but we're not really talking about that at this point in time. Okay, so one of these is going to be the most plain spoken, common sense thing you might have ever heard of. Categorical grants, this is the main source of federal aid, can be used for only specific purposes or categories. So a categorical grant, by definition, only works for certain categories. There are only certain things that you can actually go through and use this money on. Now, granted, the amount of money can be relatively small, it can be a vast sum of money. Either way, it really comes down to what the money is supposed to be used for. And if you go through and use it for something other than what you're supposed to be using it for, you can, let's say you're the governor of California, you go through and you use it for something other than you're supposed to, you can get in trouble for that, and the federal government can at different times insist that you give the money back. There has been some debate in recent time as to the bullet train that is being built from Chowchilla to Bakersfield. There is a question as to whether or not the money that went to that from federal funds was used properly, and therefore whether or not California has to pay that money back. So we'll just have to wait and see on that one. Now, a state or a local agency, okay, and that can be absolutely anything, school, police, you name it, whatever. State and local agencies can obtain categorical grants only by applying for them. Okay, you have to actually go through and you have to make the effort to get the grant. There is money available, and sometimes that money goes unused. Nobody applies for the particular grant sometimes. But the money is there, and you have to go through and you have to essentially, make an application of some kind to try and get it. Now, it's not simply that anybody can apply for the grant. There are various qualifications that you have to meet. You have to go through and you have to be able to, check off certain boxes and things like that. And afterwards, if you meet all the criteria, you've turned in the application, you may well be the one that ends up, with the money. So, like I said, there is a great deal of money available. There's a great deal out there, and it is for a variety of things, and we'll talk some more about what those things are later on. Now, categorical grants come with strings attached. Okay, these are rules. These are requirements. For example, if you go through and you're going to be getting money from the federal government for whatever, you're going to have things like non-discrimination provisions put in place. There are punitive crossover sanctions and cross-cutting requirements. In other words, you have to make sure that you're using that money for the thing you're supposed to be using that money on. Like I said, in regards to the bullet train, if it turns out you're using the money inappropriately or you're using it for something that it wasn't supposed to go for, yeah, you can get in trouble for that. These different requirements reduce or can even deny federal funds if you've got certain local or state laws are not passed, or if the federal guidelines are not met. You have to go through, you have to be able, like I said, check off all the boxes to be able to apply. Then you have to apply. Then if you get it, you've got to make sure that you're spending it properly. So categorical grants, this is where the majority of the money comes from, but you have to keep in mind there are a ton of strings attached to that. And a lot of various states, municipalities, things like that, they may look at, there's a big pile of money that can be available for them, but they don't want to have to go through and really, follow all the rules. They want to be able to use it for A, B, C, or D. And so that's why sometimes the money, just doesn't get spent. Now, there are two types of categorical grants, okay? First off, you have what are called project grants. Now, these are the most common kind or common type of categorical grant. They're awarded on the basis of a competitive application, okay? Now, let's say that you are a science professor at big name university, okay? I leave it up to you to insert whatever big name university you want to be a science professor at. Well, there are various grants to study different things in science. We're just using this as an example. And so as a result, there are various professors will go through and they will submit an application, for example, to the National Science Foundation for the purpose of getting money to study fill in the blank. There was one time there was a study about how much weight crumbled up aluminum foil can actually hold. Not kidding, that was an actual study that got taxpayer dollars for. So the idea is there is money available for things like this, but it doesn't go to everybody. You're going to have to go through, you're going to have to apply for it. It is competitive, so you may or may not receive that money. It is just depending on whether or not your proposal was the one that was accepted. So you have to make sure that if you are applying for this money, you're applying for these grants, that you're going through and you've got everything set up really well, that you have your grant writing team really set to go. Because you're not the only one that's trying to get it. There is only so much money available each year, and it just depends on how well you wrote your grant proposal to see whether or not you get any of it. Okay, so that is a project grant. Another thing, you have what are called formula grants. Okay, now this is going to be the most straightforward, easiest to understand thing ever, at least in my opinion. A formula grant is money distributed according to a formula. Okay, so you should be able to, remember that one. States and local government receive certain funds based on a number of different factors. For example, population, the per capita income. Per capita is like, how much, per 1,000 people, how much money is made. It's a way to go through and really find out how to compare, say, Ripon, California income to San Francisco income, kind of thing like that. What percentage of rural population do we have? Okay, you've got things like Medicare, AFDC, aid to families with dependent children, public housing. All of this is going to be based on a formula. And quite literally how it works out is the worse off your state is, the more money you can get from some of these different programs. So on the one hand, yes, you'll get more money because your state is, not doing so well, but you don't want your state to be doing well just for the idea of maybe you'll get some more money from the federal government. Formula grants go through and are used for a variety of different things. We just have a couple examples down here, like I said, but it's going to be determined essentially based on this calculation. The calculation is the idea that they want the most funding to go to the states or the localities that need it the most. Does it always work? Is it always a perfect situation? No, of course not. You have to take into account human nature, and human nature sometimes screws things up. But in this case, it is the attempt to try and make sure that all this different money that is available goes to where it will either do the most good or at the very least is going to go where it is needed the most. Now, block grants are used to support broad programs in areas like community development and social services. Now, block grants are what everybody wants because there are fewer strings attached. It is not as clear-cut as to how the money is supposed to be used. For example, right there we have the phrase community development. Well, what qualifies as community development? Could that be money that's going to schools? Absolutely. Could it be money going to the police? Sure. Parks, why not? It just depends on how you in the community want to use it. So block grants are they're preferred is the best way to put it. There are a lot more opportunities to use it in the way that the local community wants to use it. Now, this all came about as a result to all the complaints about the cumbersome paperwork and federal requirements that were attached to categorical grants. Okay, Congress established block grants to support broad-ranging programs. For example, you folks probably be going through in the not too far off future and filling out your student aid forms. Okay, this is an example of government paperwork. This is just part of the bureaucracy. When it comes to the categorical grants and things along those lines, there were a lot of application processes. There were a lot of strings attached, as we've talked about. It was not easy to apply. It was not easy to get all of these grants and all this money and whatnot. So Congress, listening to what the states and municipalities were upset about, what they were complaining about, what they were saying, etc., wanted to try and make it easier for them to get the money necessary to do different things. And they came up with the concept here dealing with the block grants. The reason these are liked is states have discretion in deciding how to spend the money. They'll get a block grant for community development, like I said. They can use that for whatever they feel is going to best serve the local community. There aren't the restrictions placed on it by the federal government. There aren't boxes you have to check off afterwards to make sure it was spent in exactly the way the federal government wanted you to. So on the whole, you've got states and municipalities definitely want the block grants as opposed to the categorical grants. It's a lot easier to use the block grant money, but again, that's not where the majority of the money is going to come from. On the whole, all the federal grant distribution that we've been talking about follows a principle called universalism. What that means is that there is something in the program for everyone. However, not all the money goes where it's really needed. For example, we do have, and we'll talk about this later, an aspect of government called pork barrel. And these are pet projects and things like that that do well for a particular member of Congress or senator or something along those lines. But, that might be it. Best example is what's known as the Bridge to Nowhere. It is a beautiful, I believe it's a 4-lane bridge. I want to say it's up in Alaska. And it's a gorgeous bridge. The only problem is it's not actually connected to any roads or anything like that. And so as a result, nobody can actually use it. But it's a good-looking bridge, and it helped that particular member of Congress. It helped their district with jobs and money and things like that. So we have something for everybody, as we said here under universalism. But the problem is we don't always have the money going exactly where it's needed in the amounts that it's actually needed. It is an imperfect system because, again, as I said before, you're having to deal with human beings, and we as human beings are far from perfect creatures. Now, there are occasions, and I know this is going to be hard to believe, that states turn down money. I know, it's shocking to say the least. There are some occasions when a state would prefer not to receive some federal aid. For example, Congress can extend a program that is administered by the state, so it's run by a particular state, but only partly funded from the national government. These are known as unfunded mandates. Okay? Essentially what an unfunded mandate is, it says that the state have to budget more of their money for this project in order to receive the federal grant money. The federal government will have a tendency to go through and hand down an instruction about this is, you will be doing A, B, C, or D. And the states have to comply with that, but then the states ask, well, where is the money to do what you're telling us we have to do? In an unfunded mandate, the federal government basically says, well, that's your problem. Unfunded mandates were a huge issue in the 1994 congressional races that brought the Republicans control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. A lot of states were just getting fed up. They didn't want to take that little bit of federal money because the consequence, and again, we're talking about strings being attached, the consequence in certain cases of taking federal money like this means that you're going to have to spend more of your own money just to get the little bit from the federal government. As such, a lot of states and a lot of municipalities would look at a program like this and come to the conclusion that it just simply wasn't worth it. It was going to cost them more money than they were going to be receiving. And as a result, this was going to impact their budget. It was going to impact what they could do for their state or their community. And basically, it just wasn't worth it. Yes, you were going to be getting some money from the federal government, but not enough to make up for what the program was going to cost you. So a lot of states, in cases like this, they would look at the fact that money was available and basically just say, no, that's okay. Finally, even greater concern dealing with these unfunded mandates, okay? There are the requirements that a state or local government to spend money to comply with laws, okay? 1970s, okay, we did not have very good air. Now, I know It's 2020, and we've recently, with all the various forest fires, seen a great deal of bad air quality in the Central Valley. 1970s, this was a lot more common, and it wasn't because of forest fires so much, it was just, straight up pollution kind of thing. So Congress passes things like the Clean Air Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. In the interest of full disclosure, I personally am a beneficiary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Many of you guys know I have Crohn's disease, and that is one of the various illnesses listed under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you have things like the Clean Air Act, and that's going to require the states to clean up the air in their state. It's going to require fewer emissions from cars and things along those lines. So there are requirements from the federal government that you have to follow. Same thing with the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's little things that you might not think much about, like the little, carved out portion on the corners at crosswalks. Those are intended for people with wheelchairs to be able to get up onto the sidewalk. Now, all these are requirements from the federal government. However, the federal government does not provide the money to actually go through and do these things. They're telling the state, here is a law. We have enacted this. You shall do this, period. End of discussion. And the state or the municipality then has to come up with the money to actually do that. This is a major problem for a lot of communities because now you're getting all these various requirements handed down, but you don't have the money with which to do it, and you have to figure out some way to, actually finish what you're required to do so that you don't get in trouble for not being in compliance with, for example, the Clean Air Act or the ADA, things like that. In addition to all this, you got the federal courts. Okay, they tend to create unfunded mandates for states for things like, let's say, school desegregation. When the federal courts went through, when Brown versus Board of Education required the integration of the schools, that created costs that the states were going to have to, come up with. Prison construction. Okay, a court can rule that a prison is overcrowded, ergo you have to build another prison. Now, yeah, you are now under the requirements to build another prison, but you got to come up with the money to do it. Things like this. There are different things that happen not just from the legislative branch or the executive branch, but also the judicial branch that will go through and will require different actions to be taken by state and municipal governments that they then have to pay for, even though, they weren't the ones that passed the particular law or anything like that. 1995, Congress passed a law that will make it more difficult for Congress to impose new unfunded mandates. Now, that was part of the contract with America. Newt Gingrich, congressman from Georgia, pretty much ran the Republican congressional races in 1994. Did so with the promise that what would happen is if the Republicans gained control of the House, they would bring up for a vote 10 things. They didn't promise that they would fix A, B, C, or D. They just promised they would bring it up for a vote. And this was one of the reasons that they won. One of the things that was a huge issue in 1994 was the unfunded mandates. And so as the Republicans took control of Congress, they went through and kept their promise. They wanted to make it more difficult for Congress to simply, hand down these edicts from on high and say, all right, little states, you shall do this, and just require them and pretty much be willing to punish them for not completing it, even though they had no means to actually do it. Was it a perfect solution? Of course not. We have yet to come up with a perfect solution. You might remember from when you read the Federalist Papers, they had the line on there, if angels were to govern, no government would be, or men were angels, no government would be necessary. So same kind of thing here. It is an ongoing attempt to continuously fix the problems. One thing you'll find in regards to government does A. There is reaction from the people or the states, which makes government change, something which then changes the reaction of the people, and it's an ongoing process. In this case, talking about mandates and grants and things like that, they were trying to make it a little better, a little less, damaging to the various states, a little less trying on the municipalities when it came to what they were ordering them to do.